I want to go now to one of the country's top lawyers, Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz, I mean, on the face of it, this is a total farce, isn't it?
Well, we know that there's tremendous disparity based on race in the entire criminal justice system. Rates of arrest, rates of indictment, rates of conviction, rates of appellate reversal, rates of commutation, rates of release on parole. They're all determined largely by race. Race of the victim often determines the extent of sentence. You know, for years, we did not have the death penalty in America for killing a black person, only for killing a white person. So race permeates the system. Now, it's getting better because we're conscious of this. It's far better than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not anywhere near where it should be.
I want to play you a clip. This is from juror B37, who talked, of course, at length to Anderson Cooper. This is particularly about the struggle that the jury had over what they were facing in terms of the law.
There was a couple of them in there that wanted to find him guilty of something. And after hours and hours and hours of deliberating over the law and reading it over and over and over again, we decided there's just no other place to go because of the heat of the moment and the stand your ground. And he had a right to defend himself. If he felt threatened that his life was going to be taken away from him or he was going to have bodily harm, he had a right.
What I was confused by there, and perhaps you can clear this up, but why would she refer to stand your ground, given that that was not the defence that was actually put up?
Because that's been on television, and that's in the mind of many people in Florida. Stand your ground was not part of the George Zimmerman case, but she was absolutely right that no matter how much you might feel morally that George Zimmerman should pay some consequence, there was no basis in law for convicting him. If the jury had a reasonable doubt about who started the encounter, and we don't know who started the encounter, who shouted, "Help me, help me," who was on top and who was on bottom, the evidence seemed to support the fact that Zimmerman was on bottom, that his head was banged against the pavement. As Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, you can't expect rationality in the presence of an uplifted knife. And you can't expect exquisite calculation when somebody's having his head banged on the pavement. And so doubts always have to be resolved in favor of the person claiming self-defense.
But why in that case? Why in that case does Marissa Alexander, who has already been abused by her husband, he's threatening to kill her and is coming towards her and she fires a warning shot? Why is she not able to use stand your ground? It would seem an absolutely perfect example of what that law is intended for.
Well, not only that, she should have been able to use it, but even without stand your ground, she should have been able to claim self-defense. That case sounds like a terrible miscarriage of justice, and I would expect that in light of the Zimmerman verdict, I think their chances of getting that conviction reversed have actually increased. So maybe there is some benefit that she will accrue from the publicity according to this case. She should not be in jail, based on the account, at least, that I've heard of the facts in that case.
Alan, stay with me. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to get into what goes through jurors' heads when they're all deliberating in one of these big contentious cases. I'll ask a juror from the last very high-profile case, the Jodi Arias murder trial. The most explosive and watched murder trial before the George Zimmerman case was the Jodi Arias trial. She was convicted of murdering her ex-boyfriend. She could face a death penalty when the sentencing phase begins in September. Mary Lou Allen Coogan was one of the jurors who found her guilty, and she joins me now. And also back with us is attorney Alan Dershowitz. Mary Lou Allen Coogan, you've been right where these jurors have been in the Zimmerman trial. You've been in that pressurised environment of a high-profile case. What is it like in that room when you're deliberating, when perhaps you don't all agree to start with about what the verdict should be?
It's intense. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of, not argument per se, but everyone firmly believes what they believe when they get in there, and it's a collaborative process to try and figure out what the case actually ends up as.
Now, eventually, you all agreed that she was guilty of murder, but you couldn't reach unanimous verdict about whether she should have the death penalty. How did you vote in that?
I voted for the death penalty.
And were you frustrated that more of your colleagues didn't?
Yes, there was definitely an element of frustration.
What did you think of the Zimmerman trial? I know you weren't a juror there, you weren't following it as closely, obviously, as they were, but from what you've seen and heard about it, what was your view of it?
In my opinion, the verdict ended up, this is really difficult because I wasn't there. What I did see, I don't think the state of Florida proved their case.
Right, Alan Dershowitz, this is what it comes down to. The other thing that it comes down to, I think, was fascinating from the interview that Anderson Cooper did with the juror that's been airing for the last 2 days, was the fact that she said they didn't know enough about Trayvon Martin. They heard lots of testimony about what a great guy George Zimmerman was, but they hardly heard anything about Trayvon Martin. You could argue we heard more about him in a positive way from my interview with Rachel Gentile than we ever heard in court. That is a failure of the prosecution, isn't it?
Well, there are rules that limit testimony to relevance. And after all, Trayvon Martin was not on trial. And many people have difficulty understanding that. Trayvon Martin tragically has been killed. He never should have been killed. But he's not on trial. And the only relevance is Zimmerman's actions and Zimmerman's conduct and what Zimmerman believed that Trayvon Martin was doing to him and the threat that he posed. Look, the jury system is the great protection against political correctness, against government oppression, against political pressures being placed on people, but it often makes mistakes. But we say better 10 guilty go free than one innocent be wrongly confined. So we acknowledge that there will be mistakes, but what we say is if there's going to be a mistake, it darn well better be in favor of acquitting George Zimmerman, whether he's guilty or not guilty, than convicting the woman in the segment before if she's in fact not guilty. So we err always on the side of benefiting the defendant. People don't like that when the result is inconsistent with their own desires, and they love it when the result is consistent with their own wishes.
But do you feel, Alan, that the real issue going forward, because we've got the verdict, and I respect the jury's decision, and it's a very difficult job, and it's hard to argue against their conclusion that the prosecution didn't meet the criteria for the charges that were put forward. But do you think the real issue, as Eric Holder has suggested, is stand your ground, which is now, I've got a map here, which is how many states in America have it? It's 22, I think. It's like a vast spread across the country. There you are. Look at all the green there. All the green there is where stand your ground applies. That is a huge percentage of the American population who can use stand your ground. And what is happening is these gangsters in particular, these gang members, are using stand your ground to justify just killing each other. They're saying, I was in imminent fear of my life, I killed him. And they're walking free. This is a sort of Wild West nonsense.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's a terrible law, and it's a law that really does encourage gang killing because it's a macho law. It's a law that says, given a choice between macho, protecting your territory or your ground, and retreating and thereby saving a human life, you don't have to retreat. You can preserve your macho. To give you the most extreme case, and I've argued this in Florida against the law, if you're driving your Ferrari car, which gets from 0 to 60 in a second, and somebody comes up to you with a knife and waves it at you, and you can easily put your foot on the gas and escape, you don't have to do that. You can take out your Uzi and shoot him dead.
Right.
That makes no sense at all. And at the very least, stand your ground laws have to be modified to limit themselves to a person's home, to situations where if you do try to run away, you're risking your life, you're running into traffic or something like that. But if you have the option of leaving without risking your own life, clearly that option ought to be taken instead of taking the life of somebody, even if that person is guilty, even if that person could be killed. If you have the option of not killing him, that's the option the law ought to encourage.
Mary Lou, let me come back to you finally. Two issues that were different, I think, in your situation to the Zimmerman jurors. One is there were 12 of you, there were just 6 of them. And secondly, you were not sequestered. You were allowed to go home each night. Do you think that either of those things were beneficial to what you went through compared to the Zimmerman jurors, or perhaps not so beneficial?
Well, definitely the lack of sequestration. We would have lost some of our jurors if we had to been sequestered. I know I would have been able to not sit on the jury. And
in terms of I mean, Jodi Arias, for example, said that lack of sequestration was unfair on her because potentially you could all read and hear stuff about her that could put a negative thought in your mind. However,
we were given instruction by the court to stay away from news, to stay away from articles, not to discuss the case with anyone, not even each other. And we stuck by that.
Alan Coogan, fascinating talking to you.
There ought to be 12 people
Alan,
on juries because, thank you, there ought to be 12 people on juries because that increases the possibility of having a racially diverse jury as well.
Right. I mean, I do think that one of the things here, you got 6 female jurors and 5 are white. It does seem an imbalance, to put it mildly. Mary Lou, Alan Coogan and Alan Dershowitz, thank you both very much.